Good morning, everybody. I have been working primarily with the Axon product for a number of years because I was part of the company that created Axon. But within Informatica, I sit within the data governance solutions team within product management. And essentially, I spend a lot of time sort of understanding what customers are doing, their approach to governance. I spend a lot of time talking to partners in sessions like these, either to help them work out problems from time to time or just generally help them understand the approach. One of the things that you're going to get from my session today is that I would challenge you to not think of Axon in particular as just another Informatica product. Axon is genuinely different in approach, in philosophy, to just about any other Informatica product I can think of, because if it hasn't been said to you already, Axon is a tool for the business. It's generally not speaking solely directed at the data community or the IT community, where I think you probably make an assumption that Informatica is normally placed. And therefore, what I want to do in this session is essentially justify the comment that I've just made and offer you some of the design principles, and also talk about some of the learnings that others have learned, either in a really good way, and unfortunately, some of this is from bitter experience. But I thought that if I covered the topics in the way that I am going to, that hopefully I am giving you sort of some very direct gotchas to avoid. I would certainly encourage you, if I say something surprising, sorry, Jagadeep, what are we doing in terms of questions? Are we just inviting questions through comments, or are the delegates entitled? Are we just asking them to put things in chat?
Yeah. Folks have both the options. In case they want to, they can unmute their lines and ask a question, or they can post it in the chat window. In case they post it on chat window, I will try to help you out with that question.
Yeah, that's fine. I've put various sort of staging points through the presentation, so if there will be ample opportunity to ask questions if you don't want to jump in. Basically, I've structured the conversation into 3 chunks. Initially, I was told to take up 90 minutes of the day, and even somebody with basic arithmetic will know that those times don't add up to 90. So I'm actively expecting some interaction. So, please ask questions, or please write down your questions, and we'll deal with them at the pause points. What I want to go through is the resources that you might not have been aware of so far, because they're not on the partner portal Park, which is the Axon community. I then want to talk about Axon thinking, and basically share with you some of the ideas that we were trying to solve, things that we didn't see in the market when we created Axon, and then anything that I've seen that would help you starting off. My assumption is that many of you are new to Axon, and you may not have done any projects with it at all. Even if you have, I would argue it probably takes a couple to get highly competent. So hopefully there's some things in there for you as well. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by talking about the Axon community page. Now, most Informatica products have a community page. It's just a resource which is on the on our website. It's in the Informatica community, the Informatica network section. If you're not already aware of it, I apologize. And you can see up at the top here, Informatica network. Now, the important thing about the network is there's lots of information in it, but primarily it's customer facing. That clearly doesn't mean that our partners are not welcome to it. Of course you are. And I would certainly argue that, especially with Axon, there's a lot of content there that isn't on Park that would benefit you. Because Axon, we're trying to reach out to the non-technical community, we have tried to put more content in there than you might find on other product community pages if you're familiar with them. And that's why I say that there's business and technical information. We've also put a lot of videos, and there's a discussion board, and I would certainly encourage you to have a look at some of the questions and the answers there. It does give you access to lots of documentation, some of which you might even be able to get through Park. So there's no overlap, it's just directing you to the same place. One of the things I find particularly useful about the page is in the community section if you've come into the Informatica network. Or I should probably say that if you haven't already signed up for it, there is a link later on in this slide deck, which I believe will be shared with you later, and you can sign up. It's free and it's easy, but a lot of the Axon content you have to have logged into the network in order to see it. I particularly like the content section, the content tab, because this is where you can start to see some of the content split by different categories. Now, things like knowledge base, the how-to library, you may already be familiar with, and as I said a moment ago, that's just a link to the existing things. I'm not sure if you can already get to them via Park. Some of the things, though, as you can see, are specific to Axon. The document section, the discussions, 133 there at the moment. I can't remember when I took this screenshot, but in particular, I've highlighted the videos. So again, at whenever I took the screenshot, there were 54 up. So there's lots there that you can use for your own education. It might help you out with a customer. And the one thing that I would say is that we've tried to give you a sense of what kind of video it is with the prefix. So things that are how-to, they're essentially things that our global customer support team keep seeing customers asking. So they just thought, well, let's make a video and show you. So it's basically, I want to press a button and achieve a goal. How do I do it? You will see overviews, which give you a sort of general introduction to a theme. A very popular one at the moment is our new data marketplace offering, which answers many questions on what that is and how to conceptualize it. And you can also see things with a best practice, trying to give you some higher level thinking on governance. Now, many of these are not just exclusively about Axon. They try to help you understand the interaction with other parts of our governance family, but it's primarily focused on the Axon product. One of the key things, if we move away from the videos, are playbooks. Now, as was said in the introduction, I wrote these. They're by no means exclusively my thoughts on the world. They've had significant contributions over a number of years from my colleagues, originally in Diaco, now from Informatica. We've decided to split out the playbook for the new marketplace offering, even though marketplace is an integral part of Axon. The kind of questions and use cases for a governance project and for a marketplace project are sufficiently different that we've separated them out. As you probably already worked out, only the governance module is enabled out of the box. Marketplace is an additional offering which you can elect to switch on. But whichever playbook you go into, what we've tried to do is give you a structured description of how things work, some of the options, because certainly with the governance product these days, there are so many parts to it. You certainly can't use all of them. certainly in the first year, I don't know that anybody would ever use all of them. So what we've tried to do, a little bit of product positioning, talk about how to use the tools to support governance activities, and in no small measure, try and give you the answers to the questions your customers are going to ask you so that you've got them before they're asked. Now, the playbooks are updated regularly, although if you look in the middle of the screen, you'll see the latest governance playbook is 6.2, although it doesn't say that. Sorry, I missed that. DMP is an abbreviation for data marketplace, and I'm very sorry, I should have taken that out. But the marketplace playbook is relatively small, which is something that cannot be said for the governance playbook, which is the last one we did was for 6.2, although we are going to refresh both of them for version 7. Note that the 6.2 playbook is 150 pages and the Axon 7 playbook is almost certainly going to be larger. So one of the things, it's not a page turner, I'm the first to admit that, and it is a weighty document, so it's not something you're going to want to read from start to finish. But what we have tried to do on the right hand side of the screen is basically a picture of the contents page of the marketplace playbook, and what we've tried to do is put in lots of section headings and a table of contents to try and make it searchable. So please try to use that, and please do share the playbook with your customers. It is amazing how much better they feel about things when they think that there is something to help it. The playbooks do not cover the things in the user guide, which ships with Axon. It's a very different beast. And the other thing to say is, as I said down there, feedback on the playbook, what works for you, what doesn't work for you, is something that we are always delighted to hear about. We're more than happy to improve things based on your feedback. So obviously, you will all have a relationship with either Salvatore or primarily perhaps with Mukesh and Jagadeep, or feed it back through your partner manager. It will all get back probably to me, and I will evaluate it for inclusion. Sometimes we get asked, well, why don't we put all this stuff on Park? Well, I'm afraid there's just there's too much of it to make duplication a worthwhile activity. Park has its own goals, so I've put down the sort of sectional tabs for Park on the left. I need to reinforce the Axon community isn't just partner-specific information, it's for customers. One of the things that we're seeing in the discussion threads, the further back you go, you'll probably see that it's Informatica people answering things, but now we're getting, you know, a sort of head of steam where customers are answering other customers' questions, which is fantastic, exactly what we wanted. And as I say, you can feel free to contribute to that, as well as get value from the answers. The most popular links I've given you there so that you can link through to them. The community address up at the top, and the links for the governance and marketplace playbooks. Generally speaking, the governance playbook link remains static, and we just replace the playbook in that link, which is certainly my intention for the Axon 7 playbook. The marketplace, we launched marketplace in Axon 6.3. And the enhancements that we're making in version 7 are quite significant. So I think you may find that we actually leave the 6.3 playbook there for customers and partners who continue to use 6.3, because I think Marketplace in version 7 is so different. It's probably worthwhile leaving that document for those that need it and having a new link. So just they'll be easy to find by visiting the community site and searching for them. And the other document I've highlighted here, and I am going to make reference to it in later conversations, is a document called Facet Relationships. And I will explain the relevance of that in due course. So that's just a quick introduction into some of the support resources that you may not have been aware of. I'm going to pause there for a second, both so that I can have a drink and to let anybody ask any questions about what you've seen so far. Okay, if anybody did speak, you were on mute. I'm going to assume that unless somebody breaks in now, that nobody's got any questions. Mukesh, Jags, anything from the chat?
Yeah, there is a question on whom we should contact for this slide. Yeah, I think these slides are not.
Mukesh, we can't hear you. You're breaking up.
Yeah, I think there was a question on how we can get to this slides, which you just said. We will share this slide by end of the day today.
Okay, great. Is that it?
Yeah, that's the only question.
Okay, no worries. Okay, well, thanks very much. So that being the case, let's move on to the second section, which I've called Axon Thinking. Now, before we get into the content, I have to apologize because when I cover these topics, I think there's one of 4 reactions that some of you may feel, and I just want to explain those. I would actually count it as a great success if I bore you with the content that we're about to go through. If I'm saying things that are so obvious to you that you'd already accepted them, that's great. That's really, really great. I can't assume that. I think experience suggests to me that some of the things that I'm going to say in here are going to be quite challenging for some of you, which is my second point. And I can't really make an apology for that. I'm trying to level set. I'm trying to make sure that we all understand these things. So certainly if I'm challenging you, surprising you, or even scaring you, then please ask a question. Please get these things clear in your head. Because they will help you. I'm conscious that you're spending this week in a training course, and it might be a while before you actually have to use this learning in anger. I would much rather that we reinforce anything that you find surprising or new today, so that you can make your notes, make plans to understand this for when the time comes. And the other thing that might happen, which I alluded to at the beginning, is I might sound a little bit negative. Traditionally, when I've covered some of the content in here, I've tried to focus on the positive, try to tell you what to do. And again, experience suggests that as much as, it's great to say what to do, sometimes I say things and they're interpreted in different ways. And what I'm trying to do today is I'm going to be a little bit literal about what not to do, as much to facilitate a discussion. I'm not trying to scare people off. I'm trying to give as clear a warning about things that might not be the appropriate way to do things. Again, I'm just trying to level set and get people talking to me. So the first thing I want to do is ask you to think about, what does data governance mean to you? Now, I'm not necessarily asking people to shout out and tell me what they think, but I'm just going to pause for a second and ask you to think about, if you hear the words data governance, what do they mean to you? And then I'm going to give you 4 points to consider on that subject. So I describe it, when I'm presenting on these things, as the old world versus the new world. Now, the first thing that happens with data governance as an idea, as a practice, has been around for years, probably 20 years, 25 years, maybe more. Originally, it was a technical activity undertaken by the technical community within a business for the benefit of that technical community. These days, you know, from the years of learning of that, people have thought, well, actually, that's great, you know, and, you know, having the technical community aligned is still an integral part of data governance, but it doesn't do the whole job. So these days, and certainly the way that Axon was designed, it's enterprise-wide. We expect to touch all areas, functions, departments of a business at some point. Doesn't mean you're going to work with them in the first few weeks, but you're going to talk to them at some point. Now, the value of that is that when you're touching lots of people in lots of areas, they've all got different abilities in different areas. Some people are highly technical, some people are not technical. Some people are very into processes and policies, some people are a bit more fluid than that. When you're dealing with so many different people and perspectives, you're going to have to think about your approach, because you're going to have to, at some point, speak to all of them. The other challenge that you have is increasingly governance is trendy. Governance is popular at the moment, and we certainly see more technology products offering governance, and I don't doubt that they do, but the governance that they offer is very different, I would argue, to the kind of governance that we offer within Axon. So almost you need to think, anyone who tells you they've got a product supporting governance, you actually need to find out what flavor of governance they are doing. Many of them are still supporting technical governance, and that's fine. But we're trying to do something more wide than that. Second thing is governance often used to mean how well are we adhering to some kind of plan. Now that is something that Axon has never aspired to do. We're about capturing the reality, not the plan. Time and time again, when we speak to customers and you are trying to understand some mission critical process or some regulatory report that people want to understand, naturally, if it's that important, you try and put some technology solution together so that the results are, the provenance is clear, the automation is there to make sure that it happens in a rigorous and predictable way. But again, things change all the time. IT budgets aren't necessarily what they used to be, or there are other things that we've chosen to spend the IT budget on. So the chances of every mission critical activity being fully automated are pretty remote. And that's where good old Microsoft Excel comes in. It gets used as a band-aid for many things, and sometimes those solutions are so good they incline next year's IT budget to be spent on something else, because what we have right now is good enough. And what that means is EUCs, end user computing, such as Excel, even Word documents and PDFs, they become part of the furniture and they become part of explaining how something happens. Axon is built to encompass these things, and that's why I say Axon is about the reality, not the plan. I don't want to see an end-to-end map of physical data moving from system A to B to C to the final consumption point, and somebody ticking a box whilst the business is pointing at it and saying, yeah, that's how it's supposed to work, but can I just fill in the blanks? I actively want those blanks filled in. A key part of traditional governance was, you will do it my way or I will beat you with a stick. Now, modern governance is not about that. It's not a rules-based thing. It's not a tick box-based thing. So I've said it's all carrot, it's no stick. There are many drivers for governance. It can often be, we just want to be better. You know, we just want to make data more accessible. We want to make data more understandable. I want to know where to get the data for this project. I want to know how to do this, that, or the next thing. We want to help the community to self-serve as much as they can, but at the right time, we want them to know who to speak to when they've got doubts. one of the important things about Axon is we are providing a platform where people can express that reality, and we want them to express that reality without fear of being shot down. If you can publish, this is my part of the jigsaw, this is how I do it, these are my data dependencies. You quite often find other people have the same dependencies, and that gives clarity when you ask for a change why it takes so long, because there's actually a massive community, and we need to make sure that an effective change is implemented that doesn't mess somebody else up. So clarity of these multiple dependencies is another key part of Axon. We don't expect one group or one person to do all the content loading. We expect lots of people to bring their realities in, and they have to be able to feel free to do that. If you find things that you don't like, well, hey, that's great. The first step to fixing a problem is admitting it exists, and that's one of the things that Axon does. So again, we don't want the ideal, we want the reality, and we want people not to be scared to tell us how they do things. And data governance is not just about physical data. Now, I'm sure that most of the data that gets used in your average business, 80–90% of it is just automatically provided by the IT community and consumed in whichever report, table, etc. that the business community have access to. I've already talked about the fact that spreadsheets are important and that Axon can accommodate them. But one of the things about Axon, and I'm going to be talking about this, you'll probably have nightmares about this tonight, Axon is 25 facets. It is 25 different views of different aspects of the business. Some of those are absolutely about data, but some of them are about explaining why that data is needed, where that data is consumed, how it's consumed. And that is, to me, just as important as mapping out the physical data landscape. And it comes back to what I was saying earlier about, just because a product says it does governance, there's still a story to be told and to be understood apart from that. So, there are two versions of this slide. There's one which relates it to Informatica products, and there's one just talking about the common activities that customers would typically see as part of good governance. Now, let's just talk about it in terms of Informatica products. Axon sits on top of many other products because it's trying to give an explanation of how things hang together. Now, the thing about, is there an automatic, set of tools that you have to deploy? Apart from the fact that we have a very, very high incidence of selling Axon and the enterprise data catalog in the same deal, honestly, no. I mean, the thing is, you've got to listen to your customers and understand what their problem is. If they have a data quality issue and you try to talk to them about governance or cataloging, they're probably not going to listen to you, or they're probably going to listen to you and move on to somebody else who's telling them what they want to hear. The customer's problems, I don't know if you've covered pain points. I mean, when we talk to our Salesforce and we're talking about doing good discovery and understanding what the best opportunities for the customer, they're only opportunities for us because it's something that the customer genuinely needs. So without an understanding of what the customer's problems are, it's very difficult to say. The thing is that, if I look at the second level, data quality, cataloging, data privacy management, those are specific tools which will have value to specific communities. Axon comes into the mix when you're having these conversations, because Axon isn't a data quality tool, it isn't a catalog tool, and it isn't a privacy management tool. But what it can do is it can explain the value of these activities to the wider community. It can show where things are quality measured the data that the business uses. Now, it's not that the business can't go into the data quality tool or the catalog tool, but those tools can be scary for less technical people. They have to have all the features and functions that the subject matter experts for those disciplines need. And that means that they are automatically very complex. Axon seeks to do away with that complexity and just tell that higher level story about what people need. So, you know, if people have a cataloging problem, you're going to sell them enterprise data catalog, but they might take Axon as well to help explain some of that stuff. And I do have some slides on here where I've taken, you know, a story about Axon and data catalog. I haven't done it for every product in the sake of time, but the catalog stories most useful. So the short answer is there is no standard answer, but I can only observe that, you know, customers that buy Axon tend to buy the data catalog and vice versa. The other ones tend to be more relevant to the specific problems that the customer's facing. So now we get on to my original challenge about why you have to think differently about Axon, why I believe that Axon is a different tool to others in the Informatica family. Now, first of all, as I said on the previous slide, Axon, when you install Axon, all you've installed is a big dumb. Actually, I was going to say a big dumb box. It's actually quite a small dumb box. It does not replace any tool that's currently being used by your client. Some people think it's a cataloging tool. Some people think it's a process modeling tool. Some people think it is a data quality measuring tool. It's none of those things. Because of the complexity, because of all those many different perspectives, those different subject areas, those disciplines of quality, cataloging, etc. You know, if they could all be put in the same box, somebody would have done it a very long time ago, and would now be living a very nice retirement. The reason you can't combine these activities is because of the many different aspects that each and every one of those disciplines and products has to do. And Axon can't replicate all of that. Axon only wants to share some of the knowledge, not the data, the knowledge, the learning that exists in those systems. So we often say that in Axon, context is more important than the detail. I need to do some kind of high-level abstraction of all of this activity if I want to show how it all hangs together. And one of the reasons for that is every part of the business, whether it's the legal team, the process people, the IT people, you all use terms that your colleague on the desk beside you understands without question. The people in the next room, the people on the next floor, they're not going to have a clue, or they're going to be intimidated by that language. So one of the things that we try to do, some of it added into Axon is inevitable, but all of it is going to kill engagement and adoption. And one of the most important things about starting a governance program is getting people to work with you, because you're not trying to take over from them. You're not trying to sit over their shoulder and sort of look at what they're doing. What you ideally want them to do is to tell the community by contributing to Axon content what they're doing and how it does that. But they have to do it in a way that helps people understand it. And you can probably see it at the bottom of the slide. That actually, one of my colleagues, Patrick, had to explain to his grandmother how he had created a piece of software that people wanted to buy. And his history was as a data architect, so he gave her an architect's answer. She didn't understand. He went, okay, so how's about thinking about it this way? Nah, it didn't quite work. And then he basically went down to a very, very simple level, and his grandmother got it. Now, I'm not saying that you need to do that in every in every instance, but if you just blindly copy and paste stuff from many source systems, because that's all Axon's doing. It's the basis for the information that's in Axon is the detailed information held elsewhere. If you just blindly copy and paste that in, all these people on the next floor, the next room, your granny are not going to get it. And if they don't get it, you're wasting your time. One of the key things that enables you to do this is to understand all these different facets that we've put into Axon, and to harness them and to use them in a way that benefits the wider community, not the colleague on the next desk who understands what you mean every day, all the time anyway. And one of the biggest things that you need to remember is that when you're working with clients, every time you go from one mini project to another, which is generally the way things work, you've got to remember that you need to explain this every time you speak to somebody new. And I do observe people forget to do this, which means that use case 1 is a blinding success, use case 2 is a blinding success, and then people get complacent and use case 3 kind of falls apart because we forgot to explain the basics. So please do remember, if anything that I've said to you in the last 5-10 minutes is a surprise, is a shock, you've never heard before, just remember that's going to be your next client every time. So whilst we're on this slide though, the second last point, understand how to use the facets. So I said playbook, see the playbook chapter 2. One of the things, and actually I did write that part of the playbook, I've gone through the facets one by one and I've said this is how to approach them, and I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. But one of the things is, and I've already alluded to it, some people think Axon is a catalog tool. Now, we are guilty. Some of our documentation before we joined Informatica does talk about Axon as a catalog, but we learned very quickly that actually people had a very different idea of cataloging. So I want you to be very clear. If you need a data catalog, that is EDC's job. Absolutely. And why is it? This Venn diagram is something that I've started using with customers this year. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I'm going to try and explain why I've used the Venn diagram. The largest circle there is EDC, because EDC is going to scan all the physical data that you choose to connect to it and to run discoveries and domain discovery rules on. So it's going to be your authoritative source of every piece of data. And that's fantastic. Unfortunately, some people think that cataloging is governance. I would argue cataloging is an important element of governance. Although this Venn diagram probably does explain my earlier comment about why EDC and Axon tend to go together. The thing is that once you've scanned things in EDC, you've got what the physical scan gave you. Yes, of course, you can put custom fields into EDC and you can embellish that content. But one of the key things is we haven't given the fields much meaning other than the context of the table of the resource that we found them in. Which is why, if we use the glossary, which we maintain in Axon, and avail ourselves of the integration, if we feed this Axon glossary up to EDC, we can use that in conjunction with the domain discovery rules to give business titles, i.e. an explanation of a physical field, and to give it some meaning that would help additional people from the business get value from EDC. It's important that we understand that how a glossary is, how a good glossary is constructed, and I'll be talking about that over several slides very shortly. I would also point out that a full 10% of the governance playbook is devoted to the glossary. So there's a very, very large discussion of aspects of the glossary there that I would encourage everybody to read. The problem with trying to use Axon as a catalog is, again, Axon doesn't want to be EDC. Axon doesn't want to do everything the EDC does. And why is that? Well, straight off, EDC, physical scanning, physical data. That's a technical exercise, and there is a limit. There is value that the business community can get. Certainly, you know, different members, some people in the business community are more technical than others. So some people will get value from EDC, and then that leads to confusion because there are communities who will want to visit both EDC and Axon, and then there is some confusion as to why we've got two products or two interfaces. You guys need to be ready for that. You guys need to be there to validate that, you know, EDC is one of these products that is designed for subject matter experts, which means it has to have a whole pile of features and functions that the professionals in that discipline would need to do their job. And as I said before, some of that detail makes it very difficult for others to consume that information, which is why some of that information is probably sent to Axon. Now, what data do we take from EDC to Axon? Do we just copy and paste everything? Absolutely not. So for start, the reason that there is a partial intersect between Axon and EDC is because EDC scans the entire physical landscape. Axon is only interested in the important data. And the important data is the data that the business use for key activities. So I don't need to bring in pre-production tables or staging tables because the business doesn't use them. They're an essential part providing data to the business, which is why we need to understand them in EDC and understand the lineage and 100 other different questions. But the business can't see that, and it absolutely doesn't care about it. You know yourself, if you've worked in the technology, the business just want the data that they want. And sometimes they ask you why something works, and you try to give them an explanation, and you can just see their eyes glazing over because they don't care. Now, I don't care that they don't care. I understand that they don't care because that's my background. I used to run commercial analytics teams. I just want the data because I've got deadlines. I've got to produce something for the commercial director by 12 o'clock. So Axon only talks about the data that customers see and use, which is a subset of what's in EDC. Also, there'll be obsolete tables in EDC or tables that are rarely accessed. If the business isn't using them for anything, then let's maintain them and understand them in EDC. Let's not put them in Axon. The other circle here is data marketplace, which again is part of Axon. Now, the original intention of data marketplace was to take some of these tables, which are highly useful primarily to the analytics communities or the data scientists, and put them in a place where we can publish them, we can talk about them, and facilitate access to them. So originally, the data marketplace bubble would probably have set completely within the intersect of Axon and EDC. In actual fact, what we're seeing, the reality is that some non-physical data sets, which are maintained by clients, are of interest in a marketplace setting, and you know they're things that are created from the physical data, but they're consumable by the analytical community, which is why the intersect is not complete. There are things that are unique to Axon, which we might push to data marketplace and facilitate access requests. But primarily, if the business can't see it, if the business can't see it, don't put it in EDC.
But not
yeah, I mean, we only natively support integrations currently with 3 Informatica products, which are a enterprise data catalog, data privacy management, formerly known as secure at source, and data quality. Within Axon 7, which is out at the end of the month, we're actually going to support an integration with ServiceNow for passing tickets and jobs externally. But apart from that, the answer is always going to be APIs. You know, other ticketing like Jira, we're not going to directly support Jira or Remedy. We're developing APIs that will facilitate that integration. So that's basically the way things are going to go there. Okay, so we had a question a few minutes ago, and now this slide basically just tells you everything that we've just talked about. So now we get on to the question from a minute ago. Which are the core facets in Axon? Again, my wishy-washy answer to that is it really depends on what your customer's interested in. But aside from that, what I was going to do was I was going to talk about, we've got 25 facets. You'll look at them, and some of them have a more obvious application than others. So system dataset attribute equates in the physical world to resource table field. Well, if that's the case, why didn't you call them resource table field? For the very simple reason, which I've already covered, Axon does not assume that the only data used in the business is physical data. So a system can be a resource. It could also be an Excel worksheet. It could be a PDF document. I don't care. If the business uses it, it gets recorded in Axon and its context and use is described. A data set can be a table, could be a workbook, it could be a table in Access. Again, it could be a Word document. I don't care. If the business uses it, it goes into Axon. An attribute. This is a really, it seems to be controversial for some people with a more technical leaning. So obviously within a database table, I have a very naive understanding of a database table. I just think it's one table, it's got a few columns, some of which I care about and some of which I don't. Many of the people in this call will be thinking, well, what about schemas? I provide this view to that community, I provide that view to that community. That's absolutely fine. I know you do. The problem is that where schemas are involved, and I only give, you know, the schema effectively turns into a view of a report that gets used by the finance department. Well, the problem is that finance department, you probably put business-friendly labels on that data. So although they're using the same underlying data as the, I don't know, marketing department, the terminology is of the fields, and its representation is very different for different communities. And one of the things you can't do, we don't support modeling in Axon. That's something I'm going to come on later. Entity relationship diagrams, we don't support in Axon. If you use the same underlying physical data for 3 different uses, you're going to have to create 3 different data sets and 3 versions of whichever fields you use as attributes. And that's because use 1 is dictated by regulation. Use 2 is an internal management report. Use 3 is something significantly different from the first 2. One of the things that we encourage people to do once you have some data is describe why you put it in Axon. And that is through the use of the non-data facets. So some of them are already there: policy, process, project, etc. So even though system dataset attributes seem obvious, again, there are shades to that, and I've tried to make that clear in the playbook. And this is somewhere where I would really challenge you and request of you, if you read what's in the playbook, both in chapter 2 and chapter 6, and it isn't enough, please let me know. I am conscious that this continues to be a struggle for some people to understand. So I know that I need to do more to try and help you, to help your customers. But a system, a data set, an attribute is a very, very flexible thing, but it's still reasonably obvious. Glossary, we're going to talk about in some depth later. It's the one thing that people seem to get a misconception of more often than other facets. So we'll talk about Policies, processes, project. This is about getting that business context. This is about the how and the why the business care about this table versus that table. I get data from this table. I therefore care about it. I don't use that table. I'm not that bothered about it. But building up a map of, finance get their data from this table, legal get their data from this table. Oh, actually, in this situation, finance, legal, operations, and marketing get information from that table. Building up that story of where, why, and how data gets used is why Axon exists. It's about getting that context. So it's often the system, dataset, attribute, and glossary. They're probably the 4 facets that get used in absolutely every project. And that would be my first answer to the person who asked that question. However, because Axon's all about that context, that higher level, how things get hang together, you have to be thinking about using these contextual facets to show the different aspects. Policy you're going to be using in privacy cases. You'll also use the regulation facet, which I don't have here. Process is one of the key facets. A couple of years ago, everybody was doing BCBS 239 and trying to show how they do their risk. Well, everybody in the financial services industry. I can think of 2 customers who went for the BCBS, and it's all about understanding the lineage. It's all about understanding reports, basically. I need to give this report to the regulator. How do I do that? And customers basically broke down into 2 groups. One knew the lineage of every report. So they would start and they would describe systems, data sets, attributes, and how they hang together. So they would create maps of data lineage. Then they would think about putting in the data quality so that they knew how good it was. And then they would perhaps think about the processes. Well, how is that risk report done? How do I do agricultural lending? How do I do technology lending exposure reports? There's a different process for those. Other customers didn't know the lineage, but they had very well documented processes. So that's the way they went to do it. So, sometimes the customer, the first thing they'll do is they'll put processes in. Others will go straight to systems, data sets, and hopefully the glossary. Those would probably be the most common ways to do things. But again, there's no definitive answer. When I talk about these facets being more or less obvious, our data quality facet, which integration available with our data quality tool, but also can capture data quality scores that are run by script and whatever. There are actually 2 aspects to data quality within ours. There's the local rules, which are basically the same as a DQ mapping. They're the things that actually measure a specific field in a specific table according to its validity or its consistency or whatever you want. And they give you that red, amber, green chart to give you a nice visual idea of whether things are good enough. It also has standard rules in that, and they are equivalent to the sort of generic rules that might ship or you might buy and load into the DQ tool. They're ready to run and you can read them and understand what they will do. But until they are actually pointed at a specific table, they're not measuring anything. So our data quality facet has those 2 aspects. And obviously people, one of the things is loading the right people into Axon, giving them the right user credentials, and then giving them permissions. I've classed those as perhaps the more obvious facets. And again, you get more detail in the playbook, but I also wanted to talk about some of the facets that don't always have the most obvious application. And there's a few of those. First of all, legal entity. Many of your customers are multinationals. They have operating entities in multiple countries or geographic areas. And some of the content that you're going to want to describe in Axon is relevant to operating entity 1. It's got nothing to do with operating entity 2. So there is a division that can be effected within Axon, so that it almost in a slice and dice way, which gives us that thing where we can say, well, tell me what's important to operating entity 1, or tell me the things that are not relevant to operating entity 2. I'll explain the S very shortly. We have a facet called capability. We have a facet called geography. These facets are, again, they're not the kind of thing where they have legal entities reasonably obvious, geographies reasonably obvious. This thing is applicable to Germany. This thing's applicable to Canada. But how we make those relationships is something you need to understand. Capability is one of the newest facets that we've put into Axon. Capability, client, and product. There are 3 facets that could potentially be very useful to you. However, especially with client and product, they're actually facets that can be misunderstood, especially if you haven't read the playbook. One of the things, so the client facet, it's not a list of all the clients that your customer's working with. The idea of the client is to give a view of what kind of user would typically use this system. You know, it might be a sort of marketing user. It might be a mortgage user, or somebody it allows you to separate certain assets that are relevant to a particular type of persona or user within your own company. Product, I've seen a couple of customers try and inventorize iPhone 1, iPhone 7, iPhone 8, iPhone 9. That's not what product is. We're not trying to be, you know, product 360. We're not trying to say, if you want access, you know, if the kind of things that we would use product for are, if you're a retailer, you might have white goods for the kitchen versus TV and entertainment. So some systems might have some relevance. You know, Samsung, Apple, all managing all your deliveries comes from System A, but all your deliveries and supplier relationship management for fridges and washing machines actually comes from System X. So you can use it to tag things like those in that way. It's a high level thing. It's not. These are facets that tend not to have huge numbers of objects. You know, attributes, you know, some clients have 1 million attributes documented. I'll come on to whether that was a good idea very shortly. Glossary, you know, you're quite often going to have, large companies could 10, 20,000 definitions. Processes, you could have 20, 30,000. There can be fairly large numbers of things in certain facets. All these facets on the right-hand side, they're probably only going to have a few dozen, couple of hundred at the very most, and they tend to be managed by the central team that's looking after the governance initiative, rather than being federated out and being controlled by you know, specific people responsible for specific tasks. They help you aggregate, they help you understand some of the data by giving you different ways of looking at that data. We have a business area facet, but we also have something that we called org unit. Now, if any of you have set up single sign-on with Axon in an existing project, you'll know that people and org unit work hand in hand to facilitate single sign-on. Business area is a different lens on a similar thing. If you look at a user within Axon, you might see, so if we had an Axon instance for Informatica, you would see my name, Colin Craig, and you would see my org unit as, well, let's say data governance solutions. That's how I introduce myself. But Jagadeep and Mukesh, myself, we're all in product management, but it might be that the HR system has identified me as being in one specific part of the organization versus Mukesh in a different one. Org unit will capture that because it's important for single sign-on. Sometimes we just don't care about that low-level granularity. It's fine that myself, Jags, Mukesh, we're all in product management, and the partner managers that some of you deal with, I think they're formally within sales. And again, we might not need that granularity of I'm in data governance solutions and somebody else is somewhere else. We just want to know product management versus sales versus marketing versus operations, etc. That's where, again, you have this option of making associations with different assets according to different business areas. So customers quite often, will say, well, why do I need business area versus org unit? It's really a question of granularity. And with org unit, there is a specific functional reason. There's another facet called committee, which actually it does work reasonably independently, but it just lets you define different sort of bodies, committees, user groups that might exist around the business if they have relevance to the governance function, and allows you to, with all these objects, state a contact point, using the stakeholders mechanism. You can always say, the data definitions committee is run by Jags. So if I need a new definition, I can either raise change requests within Axon by raising a ticket against a specific object, or I could go and look, data definitions committee, Jags is the person I need to speak to, I'll go and speak to him. The final thing that I've called out here is when to use regulation and when to use policy. So obviously there are a lot of use cases at the moment where you might say, well, GDPR Article 30 says I need to compile a report on processing activities. So the way to think about regulation versus policy is regulation is exactly that. It's the regulation. Sometimes customers want to record the text of the regulation. Now, it doesn't need to capture every single piece of the Act because the legal team have their own system, but we could still put the pertinent parts of CTPA, GDPR, PDPA, whichever regulation is most incumbent in your local area, in there. And there's a certain art to how we do that. But the important thing is use the regulation for describing external laws, use policy as the core for everything. Policy to me is much more important than regulation, because policy is where the individual company describes their response, how they have interpreted it. Regulations are generally quite vague, and which causes a lot of dissatisfaction, but how you react to it is more important than the regulation. So what you'll see when you start working with Axon is policy connects via the relationships construct to many, many, many other facets, so that we can understand, here is the policy for report and processing activities, where you might have a process. So policy can link to process and explain that, and then process might start linking out to glossary and systems and datasets and attributes to explain where it gets the data from. So regulation, very important for describing external regulations, but policy is where the action happens, because that's where somebody in the business defines what we're going to do about it, and that is a bigger impetus to the activity that you would describe in Axon than the regulation itself. So I've talked about some of these, in inverted commas, less obvious facets having that S in parenthesis beside it. And that S, as you'll see if you've already read the playbook, is where we've said we call these segmentation facets. And I talked about the fact that the segmentation facets tend to have dozens of objects rather than thousands of objects, and that they are primarily there to help slice and dice and to create relationships that help make search easier. Some of you will be aware when I start using the word segmentation that there's something big coming in the next version of Axon called segmentation. And my first response to that is, don't believe the hype. Yes, there is something big coming in segmentation, and I'm going to talk about it in a second, but I want to reinforce, as I've said there, Axon has done segmentation for years. It's how segmentation is done that is being embellished. Nothing is changing. The features that I'm going to talk that I've just described, those facets, they aren't going away. They're still available to you. And they provide that way to get that easy cut of things that are relevant to a specific scenario. What is changing is customers have said, yep, I understand this segmentation. I understand that I can hide away the things that aren't relevant to operating entity B. I can see the things that are only relevant to Spain. But sometimes that isn't enough. So what we are going to do, and if you've had a roadmap session already, I know you get one during the week. There will be something there where you'll be told about segmentation. But the important thing with segmentation as it's coming in version 7 is in Axon right now, we don't stop you seeing things. We can, when you use Unison Search, you can get rid of them so that you can see the things you do care about, but that's just a temporary thing which lasts as long as the active search. The difference that's coming with the segmentation that we will be delivering in Axon 7 and 7.1 is that if you isolate things in a specific segment, you then need to give specific people or specific departments access to that segment. Otherwise, they would not know it's there. And that's the key difference. Now, the reason that that's coming in is primarily regulatory imperative. So I haven't done the best practice guidelines for segmentation yet. We're still talking about that. But a good reason for using segmentation is a regulator told you to. A bad reason for using segmentation is I'm tired of operating entity B, A and B squabbling, and I just want them to do data governance in isolation of each other. That's a terrible, terrible reason for doing governance. If you've got a multinational scenario, everybody is still submitting things to head office. And if head office is getting 10 different reports that mean 10 different things, you haven't changed the world. Yeah, you certainly haven't changed it for the better. You're probably making things worse. Axon is a tool for publishing things so that the wider community can see them, understand how, if and how it affects them. If you lock things away in segments, you restrict the ability for the business to understand these things. So one of my concerns is people will use segmentation because it's there, not because it's actually a good idea. And there are plenty of good use cases for segmentation. But what we tend to find with some of these big features that we put in is, and I have to say, I completely blame some of the more technical community for doing this. They do it because it's there, not because it adds value. So, as I say, we haven't finalized our advice and best practice, but I guarantee you that what I've just said will be part of it. So use segmentation cautiously and appropriately. One of the things about segmentation is when you load Axon 7, it will look completely the same as you've always seen Axon, because all you will see is what we're going to call the enterprise segment, the bit that everybody can see, because there will always be a part within segmentation that everybody can see. And I would strongly recommend, if nothing else, that your glossary is in the segmentation, because if you start creating 10 different glossaries in 10 different segments, there will be huge overlap, huge inefficiency, because people have to maintain them, and you'll get a nasty surprise when you send it up to EDC, because EDC is blind to segments, so it's going to take everything. And I think that will be an interesting challenge. The segmentation that you get in version 7 will be embellished. I'm not going to go into the details of that. I just wanted to highlight two things. One, Axon already does segmentation, and two, please use it judiciously when it becomes available to you. No, you can't. We are thinking about how we can do it, but I don't want to sound overly confident, but we get these questions. I'm going to talk about customization soon. You know, I need this customization, or why don't you have it, or why don't you have this facet? Very occasionally, we get that, and we think, actually, yeah, we could do it. So we're actively developing an AI model facet. I don't know quite when we're going to have it, but I'm afraid, and I apologize if I sound a little bit world weary here, but generally when we dip into the reasons why people are asking for new facets, the usual response is that we show them how Axon can already do it. Now, again, I don't want to sound too big-headed here, but generally that comes from a place where people haven't understood what can be done in Axon rather than what it can't do. So we are always open to understanding emerging needs, and I think I've got this on a later slide, try to focus on what Axon can do rather than what it can't, because we've heard this many, many times, and we do believe that, you know, well in excess of 98% of use cases can be done already. But we're always happy to be proved wrong on that, and we will do stuff with it. Okay, so in the previous slides, I talked about using these other facets to create slice and dice. Now, you have to do that, as I said there, by relationships. Now, relationships is one of the most important things about Axon. And I thought about strongly recommending, I thought about begging you. I'm just going to say, understanding the relationship structure within Axon is just about the most important thing that you have to do. If you don't understand it already, please make sure you understand that before you talk to a client, because clients will ask you questions, and the answer about relating that activity, describing that activity, this thing about showing how it hangs together, showing its relevance to operating entity 1 versus operating entity 2, it is all done by creating relationships. The first thing you will do with Axon is you will populate the facets with things. So the systems, you'll put in a list of systems. In processes, you put in a list of processes. But then you'll need to say, well, this process consumes data from that system, and you'll want to make a relationship. And this is how you do it. So every object in Axon, if you look on the right-hand side, we can see up at the top here in the black, we're in the system facet, and we're looking at a system called CMD. And if I was on the summary tab, I would find out that CMD stands for Customer Master Database, and I'd get a story about that. If I was in the stakeholders tab, I would see who was responsible for this particular system. But I'm not. I'm in the impact tab. Now, the impact tab is where I generally see all the relationships that have been created between my object. So let's say that I'm the person that's responsible for this system, but I'm not the person who deals with the product facet, the client facet, or the legal entity facet. But people have made entries in there, and we can see that we have an operating entity in the UK, which is called London PLC, and we have another operating entity which is called Banking Group. Now, I can't see from here where Banking Group is located, but you know, we do have the geography facet for that. But importantly, I have 3 relationships between CMD and different legal entities. And the important thing here is that there are different reasons for making connections. So I can see that the CMD system is IT supported by Banking Group, but I can also see that it's physically hosted by London PLC. So, you know, if this was the systems that I use day to day, I might find that this is physically hosted in Germany or California, but I'm IT supported by actually the same people that you are, GCS. They are primarily based in India. So I can still get that richness and understand that. And what I've done is I've opened this object in edit mode, and I've shown you in this instance, I'm not saying that these will be available to you out the box. We tend to keep it fairly simple so that you can put in the ones that are right for you. But in this instance, here are the options. I could say it's physically hosted by, the license is owned by, is sub-licensed to. Creating these relationships and describing the reasons is the core of how Axon works. It's not through custom fields, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. It's through relationships. It's through the bulk uploads, which say process X system or legal entity X geography, which can be done by API as well. But these are the core, which means that if I search for the CMD system, I can see that it is related to 2 legal entities because there are only 2 different legal entities in here. But these are the core of how Axon works. And I've chosen the system legal entity to tell a story I've told many times. This screen killed a $500 million acquisition because a bank in London wanted to divest itself of one of its operating entities. But what they did was they did a little project in Axon to understand the impact of divesting that, understand all the processes, policies, systems, tables, data, etc. that were owned by that operating entity so that they can make a call on whether to let it go or to keep it. And the thing that killed the deal was it was physically hosted by the operating entity that they wanted to sell, and the license was owned by them as well. And what they realized was that system was so fundamental to the entire business that they couldn't let it go. But funnily enough, it was fundamental to the operating entity in question, and the people that were acquiring it said, well, if you don't give us that, you've basically killed, you know, any value in the system. So just this one screen, both parties thought, actually, this is too complex, we can't do this, and the business had to find another way of restructuring its business because it couldn't let that operating entity go because they got the clarity and understanding of what it would touch if they let it go.
That's a great example, Colin. There's a question, can we create additional type of entity, new relationship type?
Yes, relationship types are completely configurable. I'm actually, funnily enough, I have a screenshot, so don't worry about the caution and customization. Just look at this picture. This is a picture from the admin panel. Now, if you look at these names, these are the relationship types that are in the drop down. And I think out of the box, I don't think you get all of these. I think you only get 1 or 2. So many of these have been added. One thing, when you add things to Axon, be very, very careful. Don't think, oh, that's a good idea, let's chuck it in. One of the things is, and it's actually set up here, in the menu, if you want to add in a new one, so somebody's pressed the plus button and there's an empty box here, so I could put in a new relationship type. I chose System X Legal Entity because actually you can remove these because there's a minus button. I would say that currently there's a different configuration, drop-down configuration menu for every relationship type. And I think you'll find that 80% of them do not currently have this minus button, which means if you add it, you cannot remove it. Now, we are fixing that. Hopefully later this year, all these menus will have it to remove. Incidentally, if you try to remove something that is already in use, you'll get an error message saying you can't use it. You can't remove it until you've taken it out. But this is something that all customization, and why this slide is called caution and customization. Don't jump into heavy use of customization until you really understand what you're doing. And if you've only done a couple of use cases, I promise you, you haven't fully understood what you're doing and the effect it will have on the long-term viability. We've had a lot of problems with customers jumping into customization and going hard at it far too early. One of the problems is it makes, you know, if you're looking at one use case, some of the customization that you're considering will make sense because it helps you explain that use case. It will actively get in the way of use cases 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 59, 60, 61. Again, I don't want to sound arrogant. I don't want to sound complacent. But if you think you need to add 20 custom fields or 20 drop-down values in week 1, I promise you, you're doing something wrong. Don't do it. If you need help thinking it through, ask us. If you can't ask us, ask your colleague. But don't do 20 customizations in the first week. Don't do it in the first month. Don't do it in the first 3 months. Use Axon as simply as you can for as long as you can to understand the value. Particularly technical people seems to be the problem. Business people don't seem to want to do this as often as the technical people. And it's what I said earlier, just because it's technically possible does not make it a good idea. If you add 35 relationship types, you're going to cause people problems understanding which one is right in a different scenario. Less is very definitely more. But there are 2 types of customization. And what we're talking about here is the built-in customization of the drop-down menus. So you'll find, unfortunately, there are about 140 menus where you can add customization. I'm not worried. I know that some of them you'll never see a need to change, and sometimes you'll need to change a couple in the first day. We've got a couple of clients. Our default stakeholder roles are all Glossary steward, system steward, process steward. We have a couple of customers where the word steward is a dirty word. So they saw that and they thought, I can't even take this to the business. I know you want me to use Axon as simply as I can for as long as I can, but steward is a dirty word in our business. We don't use that word because it indicates if you're a steward, then something's your problem and it's not my problem. And they had the ethos that everybody was a custodian of the business, so everybody was a steward. So they had to go in and change any stakeholder role from system steward to something else just to get rid of the steward word. That is perfectly acceptable. But going crazy with customization in the early days is a fast track to problems, if not outright disaster. So be careful with that. And ensure that any consideration of adding customization adds value and is subject to a robust review process. Now, I'm actually not too worried by the inbuilt drop-down configurations, although, again, add them carefully because most of the time currently, you can't remove them if you decide it was a bad idea. So test them in UAT if you can. I'm much more concerned by custom fields. If you haven't played with it, again, there's something in the playbook that explains it, and you can configure custom fields in the admin panel. We put 5 tests that you must pass before adding a custom field to any facet. And my warning to you is, respectfully, I don't think anybody in this call other than myself, Mukesh and Jags, is actually capable of making that consideration. And it's simply because you probably don't have enough experience of using them yet, unless you've done several medium-term projects in Axon, you won't have the perspective to understand them. But unfortunately, we put 5 tests in the playbook, and my observation is that those that are reading them are not fully assessing them. And of course, I think the reality is that people are just jumping into putting custom fields in without having the awareness or the choice of reading these. I can only say one thing. We were set up to fail, just at the bottom. That is a quote from a client who told another competitor that they were going to stop using their product because they were disappointed with that vendor not challenging them back on why they were adding these. You have the opposite problem at Informatica. I am nothing but challenging with custom fields. I have yet to see, I see a lot of customer implementations, and I'm sad to say that I have yet to see a good use of custom fields with those that have used them. And I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. But don't be Don't be the person that costs your company the contract because you said yes to everything the client wanted. Please read those challenges, please take them to heart, and please use them. If you are working with a predominantly technical community, you are going to have a harder job of justifying why these are a bad idea. People in technology are much more used to customization, and other Informatica products offer way more customization than we feel makes good sense within Axon. And the final point on this slide is basic arithmetic. Does 100 equal 1? And the reason I put that there is when we introduce custom fields, or actually, sorry, before we introduce custom fields, we had 3 or 4 interactions with existing customers who said that our product was deficient because there were 100 custom fields that they were planning to add to their Axon instance in order to make it serviceable for their governance community. In the 4 instances that I'm talking to, it was over 100 custom fields that they wanted to put in. And the maximum, so basically when we spoke to them, we found all the problems that I'm going to talk about on the next slide, and the most number of custom fields that they ended up using was 1, and most of them didn't use any at all. So 106 custom fields discussed, rationalized down to 0. Why was that? Very, very simple stuff. Failed to understand relationships. And again, this is where some of the negativity, I've used the fails, quite a strong word, but failed to understand relationships. Many of them, legal entity, it's one of the reasons I've used legal entity. Legal entity seems to be a favorite custom field. I don't understand it. It's got a perfectly serviceable facet, which is very connectable. Why not use that? The other thing, of course, is that that custom field for legal entity had to be replicated in multiple facets. Legal entity already connected to those facets, so use it. So again, understand what's possible with relationships before diving into custom fields. It's one of the 5 tests. They failed to assess if they would genuinely add value. So I've already said this, just because it's technically possible does not mean it adds value to the governance program. And yet again, if you're working with a more technical community, you're likely to have a harder job dealing with this. So you really need to have done your homework to understand the arguments for and against. One of the other things is the custom fields were felt needed because the default fields in Axon didn't allow them to put in the detail from the source system. Well, that was one of the first things I said to you at the start of this. I'm not interested in the detail. Axon works better at a higher level if you are showing enough of the detail to capture the essence of things so that you can link them together and show how multiple activities across departments and people that never talk to each other, don't even really exist, but if we can show a network of how they actually unknowingly interact with each other, that's where governance works best. So all this detail that they were demanding to put in, it was just a fundamentally bad idea from the get-go. And my final word on this is, just as I said, if you want to, or you see that somebody's added more than a custom fields per facet, be worried. I'm not saying if they've got 6 that they're automatically a bad idea, but I am saying they're probably a bad idea. And this little insert here is just a picture from the playbook, just to prove that we've put something in. And on page 47 of the 6.2 playbook, you can find the 5 tests, but they are not a cursory exercise. They have to be really, really worked. Okay, so in summary, with customization, and this refers both to the drop-down configs and to the custom fields, what we tend to find is some customers try to focus on the negatives. Again, humbly, without arrogance, I would respectfully suggest that if you can change their minds, there is a huge amount that they can achieve if they focus on what is possible rather than bleating on about what they think can't be done. Because what they think can't be done is more often it's just too early in the process. They haven't realised enough about the power of what can be done. It's just not black and white in front of them. Some of the things that we've done in Axon, we've done because they are more efficient, they're more scalable in the long run. That's why I've said, and probably said too many times now, don't jump into customization too soon. A little bit is inevitable, a lot is troubling. And if you are going to try specifically drop down values, test them in UAT before committing them to production, because there is no delete in most. With custom fields, it's actually really easy to delete them, and then you'd never know they existed. So custom fields are really easy to get rid of when you decide that they are they don't do what you thought they would do. These I've got these first few slides. I just wanted to put up headline things. These are things where there are often significant number of questions, or just fundamentally bad decisions are made because there wasn't any consideration of them. Now, the first one is what I said earlier. It's all about the glossary facet, which I've already said to you is possibly the facet that causes the most confusion. So the glossary facet is not a data dictionary. For some reason, I personally don't understand it, but some people think that the glossary is a data dictionary. Now, my definition of a data dictionary is very similar to what EDC does. It tells me about every field in every table in every system. And if I'm looking for data for a particular use case, I might go in and I might look around EDC for a particular data, and I might find it's in 20 locations. So good news, I found 20 options. Bad news, I can't really decide which one's the right one to use. Maybe Axon might help me, because if I look and see how many of those attributes have been used in Axon, I might get a sense of which one's golden source or which one people tend to use, and that might be an indication. But the glossary is only for concepts. It's not anything to do with actual data. If you look at an entry in the glossary and you think, oh, that looks like a report that I use, it's in the wrong place. And I call out reports because for some reason it seems to be appealing to people to separate physical data. Nobody seems to have problems putting physical data in systems data attributes, but non-physical data like Excels or reports or dashboards, they quite often creep into the glossary, and it's absolutely the wrong place for them. They're just systems data and attributes for all the reasons that I gave you earlier. So if you look at an entry in the glossary, it should be written in, well, I'm going to say plain English, but it should be written in plain language. And it shouldn't be any particular piece of data. It's going to tell you what a piece of data might look like or represent, but it's not about usage. Also, where this temptation is, to describe usage, I keep telling you we've got 25 facets. That's what they're for. Usage happens in another facet. One of the things that might happen with other glossary tools is actually different departments are maintaining their own glossaries in isolation, because many other glossary tools support that. Now, technically, Axon kind of can if you really want to. It's sometimes a hit that you take just to get some initial buy-in and some initial acceptance. Long term, you have to get rid of it. You have to unify into one enterprise glossary. If you start uploading a customer domain and having customer ID, you're going to start getting lots of warnings from Axon, because Axon is built with the ideal of one single enterprise glossary in mind, and it's going to warn you. Those warnings don't stop you loading it, but they warn you that you're creating duplicates, and we don't like duplicates. Also, the glossary is as many facets are, is hierarchical. I can say that customer ID is a child of the domain customer, or I could say that it's a child of the subdomain of customer identifiers, which itself is a subdomain of the customer domain. Many customers seem to take that as a rigid structure. It absolutely isn't, especially because more often than not, Axon, as you go around use cases and bring different departments and areas, you're having to bring in that area's glossary. And if you think about that glossary as a Venn diagram, there's going to be massive overlap between any two glossaries. It's going to be a lot of the definitions you've already captured in a previous use case. We don't want to put those definitions in again. What we want to do is educate the new community and say, well, here's the definition. It might require some nuancing of the definition to make sure that it captures all the usage. But, you know, if you're bringing in a new glossary, it's already got customer ID, try not to upload it, try to get people working with the existing definition, because that's how you bring people together. If I search for customer ID and I find it's in 50 tables, if I find it's used by 40 processes, I want to do that with one search. I don't want to search for customer ID, find 25 definitions and have to, you know, do a journey to understand how it all hangs together. So it's very flexible. Some glossary tools have that very rigid thing. A domain can have subdomains or entities and terms. There is typing in Axon. Day one, it's absolutely irrelevant. Just ignore it. It has value later. So that's my high level in glossary. I have a lot more to say in the glossary. The process facet. I'm using the process facet as a metaphor for granularity. So everything that I'm saying here for the process facet is true for any other facet. It's about how much detail you capture. The reason I've chosen the process modeling thing is lots of customers have the ARIS modeling tool. They have a community of process modeling experts, and they do a very important job for the community. Now, just like the IT people that create and manage data, I want to understand what they do, but I am not remotely interested in the detail. So here's the thing. If you've got ARIS and you're using it to its full capability, or any other process modeling tool, or if you're doing it in Visio, I really don't care. As often as not, because of the nature of what a process modeling expert does, there is enormous detail in these maps. If it's a process modeling tool, it has all the features and functionality that a process SME has to have to do their job. The Axon process facet doesn't need that. Essence, summary, I've used all these terms interchangeably today. Axon captures the essence of the process to understand the relationships, i.e. how things hang together. So Axon doesn't need to capture 5 different levels of process and dependencies. It just needs to capture the main elements of the process. The one that we quite often use is know your customer. If you open a bank account, they have to take some forms off you, prove your ID. They then check that your ID checks out and that you're not an imposter. And then they can decide whether they like the look of you and open a bank account. Once they've decided that you are who you say you are, they do the next process that they do on you is they check whether you're whether you're on the anti-money laundering register. So I might describe Know Your Customer as a set of steps in Axon. It won't represent the same steps that the ARIS has, but it gives me enough that I realize that this is a representation of the ARIS construct. So that passes the challenge we were talking about a minute ago. It's enough information that the business understands what's going on, and there's enough clues that it's a representation of the ARIS process map so that the process people are happy. But it's that simplification that helps us see the hang together. So the Axon process facet captures the essence of these processes in a much simpler way. The process facet has some visuals and some functionality that process people will exist. But again, as I said at the beginning, Axon isn't a replacement for a process modeling tool, so it doesn't have any of the functionality. It's just trying to show how things hang together. So Axon content. We often say Axon governance is a production activity. A lot of people, and I was talking about them hiding away in a dark room, they're creating lots of content in UAT, and then they decide it's fine, and they say, well, I want to push this into Axon production now. It isn't how Axon works, and it's not how EDC works either. You cannot migrate content. So you can test stuff, you can test ideas in Axon, in a UAT instance, but it's really there to check code builds and fulfill, you know, the SDLC, which is the software lifecycle, not the content lifecycle. I know that if you've got a mission critical customer database, you've probably got about 10 different versions of it and you subject to different tests before you commit it to production. But that's not how Axon works. Axon doesn't have data, it's only got metadata. And the thing is, if you hide it away for months and months and months, people can't see it, they can't tell you whether it works for them, they can't tell if it's accurate or relevant. So you have to build content in production. It helps the community review it and challenge it. We cannot do this thing, and we get asked time and time again, and it's very clear in all the documentation that neither Axon or EDC do this. You can't create lots of stuff in UAT and then decide, well, actually that KYC content looks fine. Let's push it through to Axon. Doesn't work that way. A couple of slides which have relevance to the playbook. I'm just trying to highlight the parts of the playbook that are most critical for you to understand now. Chapter 3, the 5 implementation principles. I've talked about all of these today, even if you don't realize it just reading it now. These are the most important things for approaching a project. We wrote these in 2012, and they are as valid to 2020 as they are in 2012. Engagement and adoption. Start small, test and iterate, find out what works, and the minute you know what works, then you can be more confident of going for it. Models, I've talked about why they don't work. They're too rigid, and this idea of breadth over depth. I think I've laboured that one to death. Other things is we seem to have this thing, and it's the nature of how Informatica has grown as a technology company. One of the first things I said to you was Axon is a business tool. We still find that a lot of data governance implementations using Axon are predominantly driven by the technology arm. It doesn't mean that there'll be a disaster. It doesn't mean that they'll fail, but it does mean that they suffer a significant risk of not being relevant to the business. So get the business involved. And it's not just an executive sponsor who turns up to a meeting every couple of months. They need to be on the ground working with you. Content has to be expressed. Now, it says data sets and attributes there, but it's just as true for any facet. It has to be generally recognizable. Otherwise, you're not giving people context. And that's why point number 3, don't just use the data facets, use the contextual facets. Process is the most common one. Explain why data is used, and for heaven's sake, use the relationship construct. Yeah. The remaining slides were really there. I'm pretty much on time as far as I'm concerned. These slides are for you to read later. And of course, if you have any specific questions, just funnel them through and we'll answer them. But just remember that anytime you move from a test project to a second test project, or you bring in a new area, all these principles need to be restated. I put it up in red font. People do forget it, not in the second use case, but by the 4th use case, they get a bit blasé. State and restate. Don't take an overly technical approach. Don't jump into advanced features like automation and customization. You do need to spend a little bit of time learning the basics. And one of the reasons for that is, and I've called it micro decisions. Again, use case number 1, I used the analogy of, you know, those customizations that you're considering, they would be brilliant for explaining the great detail of this use case. They're not going to make sense 6 months down the line. So you do need to be cautious, even in the initial stages. If you're just learning, oh, Colin said don't do this, but right now in front of the customer, I can't think why. Just be cautious. I'm going to go past this one. Glossary. I just want to say 10% of the playbook is about the glossary. There's a reason for that. I've already said it's a common area for misconception. I cannot do that justice without doing a separate session on the glossary. So just very quickly, if you see glossary objects, that look like metadata, it's wrong. Not questionable, it is out and out wrong. Do something about it. It's probably representing data, not the concept. I'll let you read that one later. I just wanted to point out, I talked about this idea of domain entity term. If you've used Axon before, it's got this structured domain entity term. Now, they were only meant as sort of loose organizational classifications. They have been interpreted as a rigorous way to do things. So in version 7, we've actually removed entity because it was just doing too much damage. An entity is a very technical construct. An entity of an address has a name, some lines, and it has to have a postcode. In the glossary, that's usage. An address is usage of multiple concepts. I don't care about that. So the default config in Axon 7 is domain, subdomain, which is just a subcategory within a domain. So it might be customer identifiers, customer attributes, customer identification, term, and we've also added in metric. I just wanted to add something into the config to mess with, to challenge people. But the whole thing about the glossary is, because you have to assimilate all these multiple things, it's going to be a moving beast. The glossary that you have today, the domains you have today, they're probably not going to be the same structure in 6 months' time because it's had to adjust for the benefit of engagement and adoption. And the last thing, which has somehow come into Axon recently, is what we're calling encoding. So if you have a look on the left-hand side, not just that it's using metadata standards and it's in block capitals with underscores, actually, the name of this data set is the RISC data set, but it's got this encoding. So this is legal entity and geography. So this is trying to encapsulate things that should have been captured using relationships. This is relevant to a legal entity in the UK. It's obscuring the object name, never mind all the problems with using block capitals and underscores, which scare the non-technical community. Some people don't get that, I promise you they do. But this idea of encoding is an emerging habit, and it's a terrible habit, so I just wanted to flag up, please don't do it. That's everything. Thank you for listening.